Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member Blumenthal for having this hearing today, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. When Mark Zuckerberg testified in April, I raised concerns about Facebook's business model resting on two potentially problematic foundations: maximizing the amount of time people spend on its products and collecting and exploiting people's data. So I was interested to see and now hear that all three of you in your testimony independently referenced problems inherent in Facebook's business model. Facebook's own corporate financial statements make it clear that what's best for the company is not always what's best for its users. That's part of why we've seen so many problems like the ones we're talking about today. The economic incentives for these companies are so strong that we simply can't expect that these companies will always do the right thing by their users. As I said at the time to Mr. Zuckerberg, I certainly believe in free enterprise, but when private companies are unwilling or unable to do what's necessary to protect their customers and, frankly, individual rights in a democracy, public officials have historically stepped in across a range of industries to protect their constituents. So I'd like to take this time to ask all three of you, you've touched on it in your testimony, but to comment broadly on the inherent problems with Facebook's business model and whether they require legislators to create some level of guardrails to protect consumers, including strong financial penalties to change these companies' economic incentives. And Dr. Kogan, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Mr. Sultani, and then Mr. Patel can bat cleanup.
Thank you, Senator. I agree with everything you just said. I think it's pretty clear that Facebook is in the business of trying to keep you on Facebook as long as possible, because then they could serve you more ads. This is interesting in terms of the contrast to Google, where they want you off as quickly as possible. That's their success rate, because you found the information you want. So in that sort of situation, the model does run counter to not only our privacy, but our well-being, because the more you're spending time on your phone, the less time you're spending in nature or doing meaningful work or interacting with people in a more genuine way. I think that's all concerning. From a privacy perspective, as we've tried to educate ourselves about what are the current ways that Facebook and app developers use it and people interact with their apps, it's pretty amazing that to this day, many apps have terms of service that either don't exist, run counter to Facebook's own policies. In many places, it's actually difficult to find the terms of service, where when you authorize an app, the terms of service are way on the bottom and hard to read font, really small. On mobile, we've even found times when you're not even presented with the terms of service. So this all goes back to the idea of consent. Are we getting true consent? And I think the Facebook platform has been set up in a way that runs counter to true informed consent, and folks aren't being given the ability to choose wisely.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Sultani.
I think absolutely policy interventions are important here. I worry a little bit about focusing on consent a bit too much, because if you, it's hard to have meaningful consent if you predicate access to the service based on that consent. So if I'm prevented from using the service and I need the service for a number of features, is consent really a choice? And we see this in the GDPR cookie click-in model. I helped author a California ballot initiative that should be on the ballot in November, and two of the key points there are that while it does allow companies to monetize data on a first-party basis, it requires that companies allow consumers to opt out of any third-party sharing or sale of their information.
Okay.
And it prohibits companies from denying them access to the service. So you can monetize, just monetize in a way that doesn't expose me to the harm. Okay. I think focusing too much on just notice and giving consumers choice, it's kind of like food safety, right? So we can give people choices, but food can't contain arsenic, right? It can have different, and I think the same is true for this space. We need to give them choices, but there needs to be some baseline protections.
Thank you. And Mr. Patel.
The advertising model that Facebook, to your question, Senator, that Facebook employs is not new to Facebook. What's new is how good they are at employing it. And I think what has been revealed in the Cambridge story is how little consumers understand that model, and frankly, how little regulators do. I think we need to educate ourselves, but I think the idea that we should inhibit advertisers' ability to communicate with their customers, we should tread lightly there, because that is about speech, about free speech, and also about commerce. So we have to be careful.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator, thank